Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video we're going to be discussing a topic which is something that I feel like has become more and more relevant over time as artificial intelligence has become kind of a central focus in modern media, and especially a certain arc in Dragon Ball, which was Dragon Ball Z's Cell Saga. And that's the topic surrounding Dr. Gero. And more specifically, why did Dr. Gero's artificial intelligence in the androids, and even the ones that are biological, not follow his orders and obey him time after time after time? So join me today is someone who I've discussed Dr. Gero and the androids in the past, a legendary YouTuber, and one of my all-time favorites. Join me today, and his name is Blackenfist. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure. It's always an honor to be here with you discussing these topics. You flatter me with the way you introduce me there.
Absolutely. You're definitely worthy of that and more. One of the big inspirations for me joining the platform to begin with. So I always really love doing videos with you. But with that being said, I want to get into the subject because this is something that we saw dating back really all the way to the original Dragon Ball with the Red Ribbon Army saga, where Goku goes up against two different major androids at the time. One of them, Major Metallotron, which I guess we could assume was created by Dr. Gero, is a great enemy for Goku, but he's not one of the numbered androids. Rather, the first numbered android that we're introduced to, that we know for a fact was made by Gero, disregarding the Dr. Flap filler, is Android 8 or Hachan. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that he was a Red Ribbon Army controlled being that was meant to destroy and should have been able to, in that sense, defeat Goku, instead, he wanted to actually help Goku and became his friend and even helped him against the Red Ribbon Army. So why do you think in the case of Android 8, he went immediately against the programming, despite the fact that he was an android?
Well, with Android 8, I always assumed, now, because of, maybe this was colored by the filler and everything, but I always assumed that there was a human element to Android 8. Now, when it comes, now this is just my assumption, but I do think that Major Metallotron is very important, even though he is not a numbered android. I think it's very safe to assume that he is probably one of Dr. Gero's creations. And the reason why he's important is because he is the ideal android in terms of he fulfills the purpose of what he was meant to, what he was meant to do, right? He fulfills the duties of the Red Ribbon Army. He attacks Goku, and he eventually gets destroyed for it. And I think that when Goku destroys Major Metallotron, it's very indicative of what he was probably mostly, which was a completely mechanical android.
Yeah. Or
Jinzo Ningen, if you would prefer the Japanese.
Yep.
But he was a completely mechanical being, and this becomes important later on in the series because there is always the implication in Dragon Ball that the completely mechanical, although it's not a rule, but it is implied that the completely mechanical androids were easier to control than the ones that had human elements.
Yeah.
This was mentioned explicitly in the Cell arc, for instance. So because of that explicit admission later on in the series, I retroactively just assumed that maybe Android 8 had human elements in him that caused him to rebel against the Red Ribbon Army, and that's kind of what we see later on in the series. Now, maybe it's not the most, original or unique take, honestly, but that's really what I always assumed is Major Metallotron is the Android 19 of early Dragon Ball, and Android 8 is like basically the 17 and 18. But
yeah, absolutely.
That's basically what I would I'll go to.
Yeah, and with regard to Android 8, I mean, when we actually look at his design, he's basically based on Frankenstein. And Frankenstein, of course, was, an amalgamation of the different components of different beings, like different humans, rather, the corpses of like the arms and the legs and even the brain. So, I know that in different versions of the story, like Path to Power, they depict Android 8 as being more human modeled. So I could definitely see him being a biological. Then, of course, Major Metallotron is one, in this case, of the androids that did seemingly obey Dr. Gero's commands, as well as, the Red Ribbon Army. Of course, Gero wasn't really introduced or, I guess, created until the Cell Saga, particularly at the start when Trunks discusses him with Goku, but nonetheless, we would have to retroactively say that. And then some of the androids afterward that I believe are also fully mechanical in terms of, when we look outside the traditional canon of the movies with Super Android 13, we have those 3 androids there, and all of them also are obeying Dr. Gero, and even more specifically his computer, to where, after in whatever happened in that reality, the androids are unleashed on humanity, and then the Z Fighters have to team up to defeat them. And at no point did they really seem to be rebelling against Gero. However, in their case, as well as what we see later on with Cell, which I'll get into soon, it does seem like Gero was not alive anymore. So as a result, they didn't really have a chance to kind of turn against him, versus what we saw with 17 and 18, where, as you said before, they were human based. And it seemed like even though Dr. Gero did some kind of brainwashing to them, programming, whatever you have you, during his experiments on them, it does seem like they still remember exactly what he did to them and how he kidnapped them and manipulated them. So in that case, I think it makes sense why the androids, specifically the human-based ones, would hold a grudge against Gero and not want to really listen to him. But even then, it is implied when he wakes them up that he was doing some other kind of tweak to them to try and fix them. So what exactly do you think that Dr. Gero could have even done to the humans to make them more obedient? And why do you think it didn't work on them in general?
Well, I wanted to just say one little more thing about Android 8, because you pointed out the fact that Android 8 is clearly based off the Frankenstein monster, which is obviously true. Now, I don't know if Toriyama had all this in mind, but it's very interesting to note that that Frankenstein monster, at the very least, part of that story is that even though he is I guess you could say, artificial creation by Dr. Frankenstein, he is capable of things that are beyond what Dr. Frankenstein intended, or or beyond what you would think a monster like that is. I mean, that's, I'm very much simplifying everything here, but basically, Frankenstein monster grows and adapts like a real person does throughout that story. And maybe, him being based on the Frankenstein monster, maybe that rubbed off a little bit on Toriyama about, overcoming just a very simple reason to be created, which is, just to be a killing machine, right? In Android 8, if the Frankenstein monster is the whole purpose of him being created was to resemble life, obviously being a killing machine is not sufficient for just, like we're not just killing machines. We want more than that. And maybe Android 8 being the same way, he wanted more than that. He didn't want to just be a killing machine. He wanted something more. He wanted to choose. Yeah, anyway, I don't know if that... That's a
great point. And
once again, I don't know if Toriyama had all that in mind, but those are the themes of that story of the Frankenstein monster. And Toriyama, for whatever reason, decided to base Android 8's design on the Frankenstein monster.
Yeah, and Toriyama, I do want to just expand a little bit on that because it definitely seems like Frankenstein, the movie and book, and the Frankenstein monster, and also Dr. Frankenstein are really big inspirations on Toriyama because we've seen that kind of happen multiple times, not just with Dr. Gero, but also with like Babidi and Majin Buu. There tends to be that kind of dynamic where there's this monster that's being controlled by a more intelligent being, and then the monster kind of eventually gets away from him, and kind of like with Boo, the monster killed the creator in this case, or the controller in Babidi, and then kind of went about doing it. And kind of like Frankenstein in the original movie, or Frankenstein's monster, with what we see with him, he's kind of learning over time and figuring out how humanity works, and then he accidentally kills that girl by throwing her in the pond. And we see things like that kind of happen with Boo, where he seems to learn more and more as time goes on too. So it definitely seems like a big influence, and so I could see those themes that you mentioned maybe being in Toriyama's mind at the time.
No, you're absolutely right. I didn't even think about, but you're absolutely right that Boo and Babidi definitely parallel the Frankenstein story a lot. So it makes sense, obviously, since even in early Dragon Ball, that story was prescient in his mind that he designed Android 8 to look like the Frankenstein monster. So yeah, those themes have been throughout the Dragon Ball. Obviously, Cell and the androids are prescient in there. I mean, you just talked about Babidi being a creator. So is Dr. Gero. Dr. Gero also has these creations, which also kind of parallels a lot of those same themes.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get into another point about the androids, I believe, with 17 and 18, and then maybe some of the others. What was that point you were going to get into?
Well, yeah, the reason, if I believe it was, if Dr. Gero was able to maybe at one point control 17 and 18 fully, or
so it is interesting because, of course, we don't know all the specifics about 17 and 18 in the original timeline or Trunks' future. Like, we don't know exactly how they were released. We know in the Cell flashback, we see that they kill Dr. Gero and then they blow up the lab and Cell escapes. That was more in the anime, of course, as opposed to being in the manga. But it does seem like Gero, when he wakes 17 and 18 up in the main timeline, he said, I had to put you both back under because you were disobeying me. However, it seems like you're obeying me now. So I kind of got the impression that he tried to do something to them to make them more obedient again, but it's very clear the second they wake up that they're just faking it because they see the remote shutdown device.
From the way, once again, you're absolutely right to point out that in the other timelines, we're not even sure the order of events, right? So we're not sure. I mean, obviously, some people do claim that Android 16 was created. He just was never activated.
Yeah.
We don't know if in the other timelines, Gero activated Android 17 and 18 multiple times before they killed him, or when he activated the first time, they killed him. So we don't know the order of events in the other timelines.
Yeah.
All we can go on is what we saw in the series, and the implication is very strong that that Gero kind of gave up, or at least this is the impression I got, was that he gave up on 17 and 18 and then went on to make 19 and 20, because to me it didn't make sense. If he was still working on 17 and 18, why create 19 and 20? If you're still going to be, this is going to be your creations, right? Like 17 and 18 are the ones that are going to do the things you want. And they might be disobeying you now, but if you believe you can get them under control eventually, then you're going to keep working on that instead of, because, I'm pretty sure time is limited here.
Yeah.
Gero doesn't have unlimited time, so he needs to allocate his time wisely. So if he at one point switched over to designing 19 and 20, I would have to assume that he gave up on 17 and 18. And the only reason he even activated them when he did was because he was in an extremely desperate situation where 19 was already killed and he was on the verge of being destroyed himself.
Yeah.
So he had no choice but to activate 17 and 18.
Yeah, and also going to your point too,
that was the impression I always got. I mean, I think it's very telling from the fact that he didn't even use them when he first showed up. He used 19 and 20 to do the attack, the initial attacks. So
yeah,
my guess is he gave up on 17 and 18 because he was not able to control them, and time is precious. He used that time instead to, perfect 17 and 18 to then go on to create 19 and 20.
Yeah, that's another great point. And kind of adding to what you're saying too is that, there's a few points that add to exactly what you're saying. So when Dr. Gero wakes 17 and 18 up, they ask him, oh, so you turned yourself into an android? And he says, yeah, I wanted to have eternal life. So we know that with the fact that Dr. Gero created Cell to take a really long time to develop, we don't really know when he started working on Cell, but nonetheless that was going to take too long for him, which is why he started to focus on the other androids. It kind of lends to that idea that he probably assumed that he'd be able to live long enough to do other experiments with other robots. And the thing is too, like, Cell was specifically created and designed to absorb 17 and 18, like to become perfect. So the thing is, like, Dr. Gero makes sense to have given up on 17 and 18 because he literally created something that would become perfect by absorbing them. And then, of course, 19 is another example, like you were saying, of a fully mechanical android that did obey Dr. Gero, because the fact that not only did it do the surgery to put Dr. Gero's brain into number 20 and create that android, but also, it fought basically to the death for him. Although, one thing I will say is that I always kind of wondered, since Dr. Gero does have an organic brain, would that brain eventually like decay and break down, and then he would just stop existing? Like at that point, like 20 would just die. That's something I always kind of wondered. Like, or would Dr. Gero maybe try and develop like a fully artificial brain to replace his own? But at that point, he's kind of dead anyway, right?
Yeah. I never thought about that. I never thought about Gero's brain decaying in 20. However, it is important to point out, because although 19 is for the most part an obedient android, he's probably the most he is the most obedient android that Gero's ever created, if you don't include someone like Major Metallotron. That it's not that 19 doesn't have a will of his own, because remember, during the fights during the fight with Goku, he still was obedient towards 20, which was basically Dr. Gero in android form at the time, where he was asking whether or not he should absorb more energy from him. And 20 points out, you're being very greedy.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that 19 does have somewhat of a will. Maybe that will is very restricted, but it's not like a complete, like you would imagine, robot, like an actual robot that we would see nowadays where you input commands and then it spits out something. It clearly has its own operating modus operandi by itself that's kind of separate from Gero, even if it's very subservient to him. And maybe the reason why this is relevant is because even though 19, well, like I said, is very obedient, he does have somewhat of that will. And I think that becomes very relevant when you talk about an android like 16, because even though I've said before that these androids, I imagine, are disobedient towards Gero because of their human elements, especially when it comes to the case of 18 and 17, 16 notoriously does not have any human elements, and he was still not exactly the perfect android that Gero had envisioned.
Yeah. So what do you think it is about 16 then that kind of led him to be more, I guess, naturalistic and going against his programming and developing more of a conscience over time? Do you think that it's something inherent in the artificial intelligence that Gero uses that also might have been a factor for 19 in some ways? Or do you think it's just something that's kind of unique to 16?
I'm almost of two minds on 16, because when you talk about 16, I think the reason I brought up 19 is because it's very important, because they're both fully mechanical androids. One is basically a success in terms of obedience, and the other one isn't. We assume, we don't really know for sure because we never saw 16 interact with Gero. You would think he was obedient towards Gero because he seemed fairly hell-bent on killing Goku, but you also have to, so were 17 and 18, although perhaps it almost seemed like they just had nothing better to do, while 16 was very earnest in his mission to wanting to kill Goku, and he definitely was more, I guess you could say, robotic than 17 and 18, which were human at one point. But the reason why 19 is important is because, like I said, 19 seems to have, if a very restricted will, a will none the same. 16 has, you could say, a much broader will than even 19 has. His affinity for nature and animals, and even though he's very mission-minded like a machine would, he still has these other elements in him, which you could attribute to this like will that Gero, for whatever reason, is putting into these androids, even though you would think would make them easier for them to rebel against him. So maybe like he put a lot of this will into 16. At first he thought it failed, so he put less of it into 19 later on, so that way I guess he could be more easily controlled, or he could more easily serve the purposes that Gero had in mind. That's one of my thoughts on 16. The other thought is more of a character thing, because it was later revealed years after the fact. I mean, this was not in the original story at all, but it was revealed later on that Toriyama had revealed that 16 was based on Dr. Gero's deceased son, who was a Red Ribbon Army soldier. So this was very interesting to me. When you take this fact into account, it could change a lot of the things when it comes to specifically to 16, in that maybe Gero's son did have an affinity for nature and animals. And it's not a fluke that 16 is like that. It's actually a design feature that he is like that. That thought has run across my mind, that perhaps it's not a mistake that 16 was the way he was because of that. And I'm just saying that maybe the reason why Gero considered 16 quote unquote a failure is precisely because it is based off his son, and maybe he just had an attachment to 16, some other sentimental attachment that had nothing to do with all this like wanting to kill Goku thing, that he just didn't want him to be that way. Maybe because it reminded him too much of his son, and obviously I would assume his son didn't have a vendetta against Goku. I would assume that's something Gero programmed into him, and maybe it bothered him that he was in a way making his son do stuff or something. But that's the two minds I have on 16.
Yeah, both really great in perspectives on this. And, I kind of wish, because of the fact that Toriyama revealed this afterward, I kind of wish that it was a part of the original manga and they had actually revealed that Goku killed his son, because that would have made it like far more personal for Gero, like other than him just kind of like Goku foiling his plans. Like if Goku had killed his son, he was like a Red Ribbon Army soldier or something like that, then we would have even better reason why Gero was so hell-bent on eliminating Goku and all of his friends, because, at the end of the day, he'd be like a grieving father on top of somebody whose plans were like destroyed by this guy. So I think that would have been a great way of going about it. Of course, there's also the inspiration from Terminator 2, which plays a really big role in especially the Cell Saga, in terms of like, Android 16 is just like Arnold's T-101, the T-800, and, kind of learning a consciousness. And, Gohan is a little bit like Kid John Connor, so is like Future Trunks is kind of like Kyle Reese. So, like helping him
Well, Future Trunks' hairstyle is actually kind of like John Connor's hairstyle in Terminator 2.
Yeah, he's kind of like a combination of like Kyle Reese and John Connor, I feel like, Future Trunks. you know, it would have been cool if John Connor had like a sword and stuff, but you know, that's a little Dragon Ball Z in that sense. But yeah, it's there's a lot of those great inspirations and influences. Even Major Metallotron's very clearly inspired by the original 1984 Arnold, where I think that like Android 16 is inspired by the 1991 Terminator 2. So, you know, I kind of wonder if Toriyama even watched any of the other Terminators, because we never really see any of the influence from them afterward, it seems like. But you know, it almost seems like Toriyama stopped using a lot of movie references in modern Dragon Ball compared to back then, where they were just loaded with it.
I would assume because maybe Toriyama's is not watching as many movies nowadays, I guess.
Yeah, maybe just playing more video games. You know, we're getting like that Sandland movie coming out soon.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of Cell, let's get into him, because Cell is kind of that interesting halfway point between a fully artificial being and a fully biological one, because he's a bio-android created by gene splicing and genetic engineering and using the different components of all of the fighters that came before him. Now, the thing is with Cell, we never really get any, you know, interactions between him and Gero, because in every timeline, Gero was dead by this time that Cell arrived or woke up. So the thing is, like, would Cell have really remained loyal to him? We do get like some moments where he refers to him as like Master Gero, and he's like, we're going to become Master Gero's greatest android when you fuse with me, 17, when I absorb you and everything like that. So do you think he would have kept real loyalty, or do you think that like the Frieza and other beings within him would have kind of overridden whatever program he had to just, you know, eventually have him wipe out Gero the same way?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to point out Cell is different from everybody else, but he's not just different in the fact that he's a biological organism. He's also different in that he was mostly designed or monitored not by Gero himself, by his computer.
Yeah.
So it's almost like another one of Gero's creations was creating another one of Gero's creations.
Yeah.
Right? But I don't know if that becomes relevant, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. But the two biggest goals that Cell the Cell had, obviously given to by Gero, is become perfect and kill Goku. Now, you asked, would he have remained loyal to Gero? And I think that in order to answer that question, you have to ask yourself this. If Gero was alive and told Cell, go kill Goku, and Cell had to choose. He had to choose whether to become perfect or kill Goku. Which would he choose?
Yeah.
And when I think about it like that, I would assume he would choose to become perfect over killing Goku, which leads me to believe that Cell probably would have, at least when in the ultimate, right? Maybe he would have obeyed Gero well enough. But when you dig down deep into what Cell is and who Cell is, I think Gero and Cell are not aligned ultimately. Because ultimately, Cell wants to become perfect more than he wants to kill Goku.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing to back up that point you're making is that after Cell had become perfect, I think it was during the conversation between him and future Trunks after Trunks had been defeated because, you know, his grade 3 was useless. Cell was basically saying that it doesn't even matter if I kill Goku anymore, it's irrelevant. But he was still interested in the challenge and proving his superiority. You know, it's like our friend Danny, Geekdom 101, did a video recently talking about the psychology of Cell and how he's like a real narcissist and how he constantly wants to prove how superior he is to everyone. And becoming perfect essentially is kind of like that too, which is ironic because he becomes perfect, but he's still ultimately obliterated by, you know, the next generation. So in a sense, I definitely would say that if Dr. Gero was like standing next to him, just like he did with 17 and 18, he's like, I command you to kill them instead of becoming perfect right now. Cell would probably just say, well, sorry, Dr. Gero, but, I'm not going to listen, and either kill him or just disobey. And it's not like Gero would have been able to do much to Cell. Even when he first wakes up, I'm assuming he'd still be more powerful.
And this is, okay, but this is also where it gets kind of fuzzy, because once again, Cell has almost like another creator, which is what I said before, which is Dr. Gero's computer. So it's like, I don't know where you want to go with this. It's like, does the computer, I would have to assume the computer is aligned with Gero too, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, all of Gero's creations seem to go against him, right? So do you think that would apply to his own computer?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's kind of like Skynet, like where, again, another Terminator reference, where Skynet was created by humanity, but ultimately turned against them and sought to wipe them all out. And that was kind of like the same type of supercomputer. So it is possible that maybe the computer, if it was left alive long enough, would have turned against Gero too.
Yeah, because I think what Cell eventually became, or I mean, what he was designed to be, was almost like a ultimate life form, basically. Now, when you really think about it, do you, in theory, need to be an ultimate life form to kill Goku? Not really. Yeah. You just need to be able to kill him. That's it, right? It's pretty clear that with 17 and 18, 19 and 20. They're not supposed to be like the pinnacle of life, right? They're not supposed to be like the, like I said, ultimate life form. They're just supposed to kill Goku. At least that's what Gero wanted, right? Yeah. But with Cell, there's another thing going on. And in fact, I would even say that supersedes killing Goku, because like you said, in the story itself, you don't really think about Cell just wanting to kill Goku. No, it's about him being the pinnacle, right? Him being the best thing in the universe. That honestly resonates more with what Cell is than just wanting to kill Goku. And when you think about it, whether it was Gero's computer or Gero himself, I mean, we don't really know because the series never goes into it. But when you think about it, maybe that's what Gero wanted, because Cell is so different from Gero's other creations, all of them. Android 8, 17, 16, 20, because they're not supposed to be like the pinnacle of life. Gero intentionally designed Cell to absorb 17 and 18. So maybe Gero, in a way, because, Cell, if all according went to plan, Cell would have became perfect. He would absorb 17 and 18, become the ultimate life form, and then, I mean, if we're being honest, he would probably have killed Goku after that. So, in a way, maybe Gero got what he wanted with Cell, because even though I would definitely think Cell would pick becoming perfect over killing Goku, in a way, by becoming perfect, he's going to kill Goku eventually anyway, and maybe Gero already made that calculation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So he would have been fine. What I'm saying is, if he were to have been killed by Cell, he might have been fine with it, because he knows Cell is going to follow his programming of becoming perfect. And that road is eventually going to lead to Goku's death anyway. So in a way, I almost think that maybe Gero, even if he were to be killed by Cell, he would have not minded being killed by Cell, in the same way he obviously would have minded being killed by 17 and 18 or 19 or any of his other creations. He might have not even minded being killed by Cell.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of like all the points you were making, I think that another great theme I just realized, that's another reason I always really like these conversations, is that Cell, in a sense, is kind of just like Gohan, where he is like the next step, the next generation, the next creation. We have to kind of wonder why Dr. Gero wanted to create androids to begin with. Like, what was his real goal when he first created Android 1, for example, right? Like, why did he get into this anyway? And so maybe this was his true goal all along, to create the ultimate life form, to progress existence, basically. And this was like his ultimate like prodigy or progeny stepping forward, just like Gohan was Goku's. Inevitably, the two of the next generation stepping forward were the ones that had the final battle in the arc, and one of them overcame the other, which was Gohan when he defeated Cell. So that's another great point. Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Prometheus movies like that, or Alien Covenant, but it's a lot like the android David wants to create the ultimate life form, and that's the xenomorph, the alien from the Alien movies. And it's kind of like the same idea in a sense, where this android creates this ultimate biological being that ends up being like a monstrous being that wants to kind of spread and destroy everything, very similar to how Dr. Gero also creates Cell to want to do the same thing. So it is kind of maybe Toriyama did have a little, or maybe Ridley Scott in this case took inspiration from Toriyama after he took inspiration from Ridley Scott for the Alien.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. The only wrinkle I would add to that is obviously Gero's computer, because I think that you can't like just ignore the fact that Cell was supervised by Gero's computer.
Yeah.
While, I mean, it could very well be that Gero was exactly the way I described, where Cell did exactly what he wanted. Even if Cell were to kill Gero for wanting to become perfect over killing Goku, that's still basically maybe what Gero wanted, because in becoming perfect, he would have eventually killed Goku anyway, right?
Yeah.
However, there's also the wrinkle of the computer, and the reason why there's the wrinkle of the computer is, well, even if you think that Gero was still so focused on just the single-minded thing of killing Goku, and he didn't care about this ultimate life form or having these grander goals of, like you said, progressing life itself or something like that, and he was just singularly focused on killing Goku, it still kind of works, because even if Gero himself was like that, but he left it to his computer, so maybe his computer came to the calculation, well, I can fulfill your wish, Gero, of killing Goku, but I can do a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Like, how, like, then the computer, you can have, like, this is a common theme in a lot of sci-fi, where in the machine itself will still operate under the creator's intentions, but just not in the way he thought, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like, this is so common in all of sci-fi, where, the robot will still be governed by laws, but it's not in an unforeseen way that humans had not thought of. And the Dr. Gero's computer could have been in the exact same thing. It could have been where, we're going to kill Goku too, but we're going to do a lot more than just kill Goku. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like you're talking about science fiction, like Isaac Asimov, like I, Robot, for example, where they have the different laws that the robots and the artificial intelligence could not go outside of, and yet they still kind of find ways of going around them in terms of either loopholes or in terms of trying to take their ideas even further. So that's really a great point. We don't know how self-aware Dr. Gero's computer was, and if it had its own goals too. It would make sense if it was self-aware, because the fact that it was controlling all of these different aspects with the robot droids that were going out and getting the data and doing things that Gero was completely unaware of, like taking Frieza's data, for example, and kind of acting autonomously. So maybe, like you're saying, and you could even attribute
I would have to assume, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Dr. Gero's computer was at least autonomous, that it was operating under itself. Whether it was just operating under like strict instructions from Gero, or it had some sort of autonomy in terms of like it could do things on its own that maybe Gero didn't foresee. I lean on that, because it seems all of Gero's creations we're doing that anyway. I mean, 8 did that, Android 8 did that, 16, we don't know for sure if he did that, but certainly you could see glimpses in 19 doing that, even though he was super obedient, and so did 17 and 18. So it's pretty safe to assume that, Gero's computer probably had, it certainly had autonomy, and I think it could do things that maybe even Gero didn't foresee.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great point. And really, I think all this comes down to just these concepts of artificial intelligence, which is one of the things that I just have always found so fascinating in movies and just in general, whether it be Terminator or Alien or Blade Runner or Dragon Ball Z. It's a really fascinating concept, and the way that Toriyama executes it, is something that doesn't really get enough credit. So that's why we could talk about this subject so in depth, and we could probably go on for hours about this, but at the end of the day, I feel like that, like we talked about during this video, the reasoning for it probably comes down to not only like the human component with like 17, 18, and possibly Android 8, but also the fact that when Dr. Gero creates these androids, he wants to make them almost like his perfect slaves, like the beings that will do everything for him at his whim. But ultimately, because of the nature of personality of the mind and everything, when he tries to replicate that in these machines, they always will kind of go against him a little bit or have their own motives or modus operandi, like you said before. So as a result, we will get 19 who wants to be greedy and wants to run away from Vegeta when he's going to get killed. We do get 16 who wants to play with nature and, eventually doesn't want to kill Goku anymore, aside from Cell, because he's technically part Goku, right? And then, we get some of the other androids that disobey him. So, it is interesting to think maybe the only one that ever truly would have done exactly what Dr. Gero wanted was Android 20 himself, Dr. Gero, because even his own computer and Cell might not have been doing exactly what he wanted the whole time, or at least not in the way that he saw it. So do you have any other points or anything else you want to say before we go?
I think I pretty much exhausted what I had to say, unless you had something else to bring up.
No, I think that we went really in depth in this, and that's why we're going to leave it up now to everyone in the comments. This is a really fascinating discussion, so let us know your own thoughts down below. Make sure to check out Black and Fits. He has so much great content that he made over the years, and here's hoping that he'll make something else in the future. But with that being said, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you're new here, like, share, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Beautiful friends, thank you for watching Laughingstock Media.
Yeah, and you better subscribe, enable those damn notifications.